Okay, champions, I'm not going to relive the entire Cold War for you, but I am going to go through and give you some tips and tricks to prepare for not just Paper 2, Topic 12, Cold War, but also for my HOA friends, Paper 3, Section 16, Cold War. Just some quick reminders. When we're writing paper 2, we are writing one essay in each of the subjects we prepared for. So for you guys, that means you're writing paper 2, topic 10, authoritarian states, one of those essays, and you're writing one paper 2, topic 12, Cold War essay. You don't have to write them in order. So if you want to write the Cold War essay first, by all means go ahead. Just make sure you're using the correct number when you're writing it in the boxes on the answer sheet. Paper 3 people, you're more than welcome to write either of the 2 Cold War essays that they give you. Chances are you might only be able to answer one of those questions because it might have information that we did not study. Just a reminder on our essential questions or understandings, we were looking at rivalry, mistrust, and accord, leaders and nations, and Cold War crises. Here are your previous Cold War superpower tensions and rivalries of the 20th century questions that have been asked. These are going to be questions number 23 and 24, and they follow a similar format every year. So you should prepare for this by making sure you're up to date on your chronology, making sure you have 2 separate regions, and I would also make sure you know 2 separate crises, each from a different region. In the beginning, they really leaned hard in the early stages of the Cold War, which is why we did so much work on the early stages of the Cold War. And then later, they started bringing in late Cold War information, which is what we're going to be working on very soon. But we need to be prepared for both, and we need to be prepared for regional information as well. In terms of IB command terms, know that compare and contrast, or compare singular and contrast singular, mean compare and contrast. Analyze, discuss, and evaluate are used most often. So if we look here, evaluate. These get a lot of to what extent questions. Here's evaluate, here's discuss. Just be prepared to answer any of those format questions. Here I've color-coded the questions that lean in the chronological direction and the questions that you can absolutely answer compare-contrast. You could technically use compare-contrast with the chronological questions. Sort of an AP world, changes and continuities over time works well for the chronological, but definitely the number 24 will be a compare-contrast question. But it might be sneaky. It might be excluding the US and the USSR, which is why you have to prepare for different regions. And here we have the later questions, chronological versus compare contrast, 2 countries each chosen from a different region. Got to be prepared. Here are the paper 3, section 16, Cold War in the Americas questions. If you look at the time period, it's 1945 to 1981. Sometimes you'll be able to answer both of them. The impact of the Korean War on 2 countries of the Americas. Well, you definitely have that for the United States, but do you have it for another country? Discuss the reaction of either Canada or Latin America towards U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War. Could you have answered either of these or both of these? That's up to you. Fear of communist expansion was the main reason for U.S. involvement in Vietnam. To what extent do you agree with this statement? You know that do you agree or to what extent do you agree is a trap. We never answer with I, me, my, or we. We're not going to do I somewhat agree, I somewhat disagree. You're going to take a stance, you're going to provide the counter, and then you're going to have a post-revisionist argument justifying the two. You should know your Cold War presidents. In terms of my recommendations for your preparation, I think that LBJ is definitely somebody that you should know in terms of his foreign and domestic policy. I think this year knowing Eisenhower would be incredibly helpful. And for my HOA kids, I think that you should go back and review FDR, especially in terms of domestic policies, but also in foreign policies, because those later conferences in World War II are going to be the groundwork for the Cold War. And if you look back at those questions, many of those questions begin in the 1940s. Here's just the Cold War timeline that I've put on a number of different packets that I've given you or review materials so that you can see it in context, that you can see it in regards to who was in charge of the Soviet Union at the time, and perhaps that will be helpful for you. Chronological developments. You need to know chronology for this. So that's what I'm kind of going to be harping on for the duration of this presentation, PowerPoint, video, whatever we want to call it. And then in terms of question 24, compare contrast, we have to be able to address these regionally, which is why in class we did so many Cold War case studies by region. You have plenty of information on origins of the Cold War through 61, which is usually a topic they ask about. You have plenty of information on key people and on case studies. Remember a long, long time ago, I gave you a sheet that you could use to keep track of Cold War origins in terms of evidence and interpretations. It might be worth going back and digging this up. It has unicorns on it, and doing this as a Cold War review, it would be helpful. This is from a million years ago, but I still think it's incredibly helpful in terms of origins of the Cold War. I actually went further than 55 here. I took it through the 60s and then even added some 70s and maybe later 80s information. Had I been in class for you guys, we would have done an activity where I would have given you events in the Cold War and we would have placed them on a timeline, but here's an example from a previous class that you might find helpful. For my HOA friends, you want to be aware of or up to date on presidential doctrines and how that impacted not just foreign intervention, but domestic policies as well. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to give you a decade, and then I'm going to try and give you 3 things to remember from this decade. Trying to make it bite-sized, trying to make it helpful. So 1940s, think World War II, Berlin, and Mao. I know that World War II begins before the 40s, but for this particular decade, the culminating conferences that happen with the Grand Alliance, aka the Big Three, are going to be helpful. We spent an amount of time on Yalta and Potsdam, about the Germany question, about the Japan question. World War II segues well into what happens in Berlin, the restructuring of Berlin, Berlin blockade, Berlin airlift, a divided Berlin that does not reunify until 1991. And at the same time, contemporaneously, Mao is not only going to be participating in World War II as part of the United Front, but post World War II, they're going to resume their civil war. The Chinese Communist Party against the nationalists, the KMT or the GMD, the Kuomintang. And 1949 is the date you should remember for Mao with the establishment of the PRC. If you wanted to bring some other information into the 1940s, remembering George Kennan's long telegram, Article X, and the ideas of containment and domino theory, that would serve you well for the Cold War. You have all of this information on the Cold War timeline in great detail, so all of the other dates and information that are relevant. It also includes rights and protest information, so you can go back and simultaneously study for paper 1. You have lots of material on Mao and the PRC. You have lots of material on his rise to power, both of them. His maintenance of power. This is paper 2, topic 10, authoritarian states. So you can go back and look at that material. For 1950s, I'm going to say the 3 things we want to remember are Korea, Egypt, and Hungary. We spent some time on Korean War as a case study, especially as the first testing of the United Nations on that 49th parallel being, my apologies, it's 48th parallel. I went back in and fixed it right quick. And the armistice, but not signing of a peace treaty, and the establishment of the DMZ or the demilitarized zone. Though we did not do the entire unit on Nasser's Egypt, we did spend time on the Aswan Dam and the Suez Crisis. That's also helpful in terms of Eisenhower Doctrine. Paper 3 people, are we listening? And then simultaneously, or as a result of Khrushchev's perceptions or world perceptions in the Suez Crisis, he is brutally going to crush the Hungarian uprising. If you wanted to bring in additional information for the 1950s, knowing NSC 68 or the establishment of the Warsaw Pact as a counter to NATO in 1949, that would be helpful. Again, all of this information is on your timeline in great detail. I would look over that and maybe pause the video and take a look at this slide. You have all sorts of Korean War material that you can go back and use. I sort of did a mashup of some of our Nasser slides and Suez Crisis information. 1960s. This is a tough one because there were so many choices, but I would go Berlin, Cuba, Vietnam. We're looking at the second Berlin crisis, standoff at Checkpoint Charlie, and the construction of the Berlin Wall. We get all sorts of juicy Cuba information here, though the Cuban Revolution is going to be 1949. I did not mean to advance that slide. We have the Bay of Pigs invasion, and we have the Cuban Missile Crisis. And at the same time as all of that is happening, we have escalation in Vietnam. So the 1960s would be a decade I think you should go back and study. Other information you could bring in would be non-aligned movement, Kennedy Doctrine, Six-Day War, Brezhnev Doctrine, Prague Spring, Vietnamization. There's just so much in the 1960s that we could use as information for a Paper 2 Topic 12 Cold War essay. So much that it was very difficult to fit it on one doc or in one slide. So Hoa people, your Section 14 political developments in the Americas after the Second World War, 45 to 79. This is a place that you can bring in Castro information. So by preparing for Cold War information and authoritarian states information, you're also preparing for one of your paper 3 topics. However, compare and contrast the treatment of opposition by 2 Latin American populist leaders means you would need to know one more than Castro. But sometimes we luck out and we get a Castro-specific question, like to what extent did the Cuban Revolution and the rule of Fidel Castro bring about political and economic change in Cuba? Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. You have plenty of information on Castro and how he can be used in multiple papers that we write. You could even bring him in as outside information for something like South Africa with the Angolan Civil War. With plenty of Vietnam information you can go back and reference. In terms of chronological developments in the later Cold War, I'm going to couch that as 70s to 90s, early 90s like 91. We're really looking at the changes in the superpower relationships, shifting alliances and diplomacy, long-term impact of the Cold War, conflicting aims and policies, and determining if there was in fact a victor or if the Cold War really ended. You have plenty of key leaders. I would focus, late Cold War, I'd focus on Gorbachev. Middle of Cold War, I'd focus on Khrushchev and Brezhnev. You have lots of other outside information you could bring in as well. I've given you key presidents, key people, even more key people by region and location, and in general, just bulleted points of what was happening. For the 1970s, I would focus on Detente. I put Deng in here as well as Soviets in Afghanistan. In terms of détente, we're referring to the easing of tensions following the Cuban Missile Crisis. We're also looking at cooperation or coordination between the US and the Soviet Union, notably in the SALT treaties, but also the Helsinki Accords. I don't expect you to write much about Deng Xiaoping and the 4 modernizations in China or Tiananmen, but I'm putting it on here because I would be remiss to do so. And then in terms of the Soviet Union, I would definitely spend some time going back and reviewing their invasion of Afghanistan and how this relates to the Brezhnev Doctrine. In terms of colloquial history, we sort of refer to this as the USSR's Vietnam, but you might also want to investigate the role of the United States in supporting the Mujahideen. There are other factors to consider in the 70s: Yom Kippur War, Camp David Accords, fall of Saigon, Iranian Revolution. It would be worth touching upon those events as well. I have them here for you. 1980s, now we're pushing to the end of the Cold War time period. I would go with fall of the USSR, independence in Eastern Europe, and none of that nonsense in China. Specifically looking at the policies of Mikhail Gorbachev in the USSR: glasnost, openness, perestroika, restructuring, democratization, alcohol reforms, Chernobyl. The world is your oyster here. We want to look at the Sinatra Doctrine. Everybody gets to do it their way. And then the results of these policies coming to fruition would be Gorbachev losing his power and the USSR losing itself as an entity, and the role of Boris Yeltsin in Russia and the CIS. I would not look at every single independence movement in Eastern Europe. I would perhaps pick two or maybe three that I would review. I think the solidarity movement in Poland would definitely be worth looking at. Singing revolutions in the Baltic states are fascinating. I'm, of course, going to say there's always time for Ukraine, but perhaps Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia or the fall of the Ceausescus in Romania might be more your speed. I know I put this here as Eastern Europe, but remember, this is also going to be the fall of the Berlin Wall and the turning point that leads to reunification for Germany. I know I mentioned Deng Xiaoping and Tiananmen in the previous slide, but since this happens in 1989 and its student protests focused at democratization, and that had been something that had been a policy of Mikhail Gorbachev, it's interesting to look at what happened at the USSR versus what happened to the PRC. Again, I have more of this information for you on that review sheet. And we have to decide for ourselves in the 90s, was that really the end of the Cold War? It did lead to the appointing of Vladimir Putin, and he's making a mess for us right now, so something to consider. I do have a little chronology on your Soviet leaders here. You definitely want to go back and review Khrushchev, Brezhnev, specifically with the Brezhnev Doctrine and the exercising of such. You don't need to go back and review Andropov and Chernenko. They're the results of gerontocracy, and honestly, they don't last that long. You want to look at Gorby and maybe some Yeltsin. I've also broken this down geographically for you if that works a little better. So same information, just different presentation. We've also given you regional developments that might be helpful. And then a quick reminder on historiography. More specific historiography. And you can always bring in your Cold War theories. I would focus on Russian menace, US imperialism, class conflict, which is Marxism, and then superpower and arms race. In terms of paper 2 tips, they also overlap with our paper 3 tips. This is a formal essay. It's going to have an introduction and a conclusion. It should have 3 body paragraphs. You should be specific. Remember, you don't have documents for this, so you have to bring all the information to the table. You're capitalizing your proper nouns. You could underline key information if you wanted to. You don't have to. You want to use those palabras picantes, avoid those dead possum words, leave yourself space, don't write outside the margins. And if you can, save yourself time to go back and read it over. But if you're pressed for time, I would prefer you do a pre-write and then write the essay rather than save the time to go back and edit. Again, this is our ice cream sundae, so a well-structured, effective, organized essay, clearly focused and aware of the demands and implications of the question. You're providing accurate and relevant information. The more specific you are and the more analytical you are, the better this ice cream sundae is going to be. You want facts, examples, and details. You want analysis, and then you want historiography. Here are your thesis tips. You want to make sure you have a strong argument. You can use answer the Q, opposing view, justify the two, but you don't have to. Some of these are going to set themselves up well to write as compare contrast, but the chronological ones might be better as a change over time structure.